Wall Street Queen. 38 million Americans heard Neil Gorsuch hurl those words at Jasmine Crockett, live inside Congress. The chamber froze, the air cracked with fury, and justice itself trembled. What did Jasmine do next that shook the nation to its core? Washington woke up under heavy clouds that morning. The Capitol dome glowed like fire against the gray sky. It didn't feel like a normal day. It felt like the calm before a storm. Inside those marble halls, two names were about to collide. Jasmine Crockett, daughter of struggle, fighter for the people. Neil Gorsuch, Supreme Court Justice, untouchable, Wall Street's crown. And before the day ended, one of them would break. Jasmine didn't grow up with privilege. She grew up watching neighbors work two jobs just to keep the lights on. Families breaking apart because justice was too expensive to reach. Every scar in her story had sharpened her voice, and today that voice had to carry the weight of millions. Gorsuch was different. He wore power like armor. Years of rulings in favor of corporations had built him a reputation. Cold, precise, loyal to the moneyed few. He wasn't just walking into a hearing, he was stepping onto a throne, ready to strike anyone who challenged him. The fight was over prescription drug prices. Sounds technical, right? But behind the numbers were real lives. Veterans rationing pills, grandmothers splitting doses, parents deciding between rent and the medicine that kept them breathing. For Jasmine, this wasn't politics. This was survival. And as the cameras flicked on, broadcasting to tens of millions, there was no more hiding. The storm was here. And the only question left was simple. When the first blow landed, who would rise and who would break? Across America, living rooms turned into front row seats. Old factory workers in Ohio sat hunched over their screens, calloused hands gripping bottles of insulin like lifelines. In Texas, a single mother balanced her father's $800 medicine on her lap, praying this hearing would mean he wouldn't have to choose between rent and survival. In Detroit, a nurse still in scrubs sat at her kitchen table, eyes red from a double shift. She had watched too many patients die for lack of medicine. And tonight, as she stared at the screen, she wondered, would Jasmine fight hard enough to stop the next death? For her, Jasmine wasn't just another politician. She was the one carrying their stories into that marble chamber. Everywhere the country held its breath. This wasn't about numbers, it was about survival. And across America, millions asked the same question. Would Jasmine rise, or would Wall Street crush her like all the rest? And the cameras would broadcast it all. Live, no place to hide. When Jasmine pushed open the chamber doors, the air felt heavy, like she was dragging the hopes of an entire nation on her shoulders. She could almost hear the voices of those watching, pleading, demanding, daring her not to flinch. She wasn't just walking into a hearing, she was walking into history. And in that moment, as millions leaned closer to their screens, one question echoed louder than the thunder outside. Would Jasmine be their champion? Or would she fall under the gavel of power? The gavel struck, and the hearing began. Papers shuffled, cameras zoomed in, and the nation leaned forward. Jasmine rose with calm fire, laying out the cold numbers. Prescription costs climbing faster than wages. Families crushed under the weight of pills they couldn't afford. For a moment, the chamber listened. Charts and statistics flashed on the screen behind her. She spoke not like a politician, but like a woman carrying the pain of every American who had begged a pharmacist to lower the price. The chamber leaned in. Then came the strike. Then, without warning, Gorsuch leaned in. His voice sliced through the air like a blade. "Congresswoman, spare us. You are nothing but a Wall Street queen." The words detonated in the room. Conversation stopped mid-breath. Reporters froze, their pens hovering above paper. The insult wasn't just aimed at Jasmine. It was a dagger thrust at every struggling American watching from home. The wound was real, but the question cut deeper. Would she bleed or would she fight? The camera closed in on her face. For half a second, silence swallowed the chamber. Her eyes flashed, not with shame, but with something hotter, something dangerous. Across the country, millions of viewers felt their hearts pound. Would she crumble under the insult? Or would she rise and turn it into a weapon? One sentence had just redrawn the battlefield. And the only question that mattered now was this. Would that fire burn Jasmine to ashes? or ignite a blaze powerful enough to set America alight. The words hung in the air like a gunshot. Wall Street Queen. Even the hum of the cameras seemed to pause. Reporters glanced at each other, stunned, as if wondering if they had just witnessed a career-ending blow. In the gallery, jaws dropped. A veteran clenched his fists. A nurse whispered under her breath, "Did he really just say that?" Across America, millions sat frozen on their couches, anger crawling up their spines. News anchors cut in almost immediately, voices sharp, debating live as the insult replayed on loop. Did Justice Gorsuch just destroy her credibility? One asked. Another countered. Or did he just hand her the fight of her life? The split screen told the story. Commentators divided. The public enraged. Jasmine stood silent, her hands steady on the desk. Outside, she looked calm, almost stone-like. But inside, her pulse thundered. Every insult she'd ever heard echoing back. Every time someone tried to shrink her down to nothing. This was different. This was on live TV, before millions. She could feel the weight of the insult pressing on her chest, daring her to break. But behind that weight, something else stirred. Hotter, sharper, a fire rising, demanding to be unleashed. Because this wasn't just about her. This was about the people who couldn't fight back. The ones splitting pills. The ones dying quietly because medicine had become a luxury. If she stayed silent, she'd betray them. And so the question wasn't whether she'd answer. The question was, how do you turn humiliation into a weapon of justice? Jasmine didn't flinch. She reached into her bag, pulled out a tiny amber bottle, and held it high under the chamber lights. Her voice cut through the silence. $800, the price of staying alive in America today. The room stiffened. Reporters leaned forward, cameras zoomed in, catching the way that small bottle gleamed like evidence in a trial. She turned, eyes locking with the audience behind her. She told the story of a veteran, 62 years old, who had to cut his pills in half because he couldn't afford a full dose. A man who had served his country only to come home and find that medicine cost more than his mortgage. Her words carried the weight of his sacrifice and the cruelty of a system that had abandoned him. Then it happened. A gray-haired man in the gallery pushed himself to his feet. His hands trembled as he raised his own insulin vial high above his head. His voice cracked, but it carried like thunder. Do you know what it feels like to choose between rent and life? The chamber went silent. No shuffle of papers, no whispers. Just raw human truth hanging in the air. The camera swept the room, faces wet with tears, jaws clenched in anger, hearts breaking in unison. Jasmine lowered her bottle slowly, her eyes never leaving Gorsuch. One insult had tried to define her, but now a nation was defining him. And the question echoed, louder than any gavel strike. Has the wall of Wall Street begun to crack? By nightfall, the nation was on fire. News anchors replayed the clip again and again. The gray-haired veteran's trembling hand, the tiny vial of insulin glinting under the lights, his voice cracking as he shouted for his life. It spread like a shockwave, no longer just a moment in Congress, but a symbol of America's broken promise. On Twitter, hashtags exploded. Not for sale. People over profit. Within hours, millions of posts carried Jasmine's defiant image, her eyes burning as she held that bottle high. On TikTok, teenagers clipped the veteran's cry, rent or life, over rap beats. While on Facebook, grandparents shared it with tears in their captions. The clip passed 1 million views, then 5, then 10. Families huddled around phones at dinner tables. Strangers cried in grocery store lines, watching it play on repeat. It wasn't just news, it was a mirror, and America was finally forced to look. Inside the chamber, Gorsuch sat stiff, face carved in stone. But when the camera lingered too long, a flicker crossed his eyes, something close to doubt, maybe even fear. For the first time, the untouchable mask cracked. Jasmine leaned toward her mic, not shouting, not grandstanding, just letting the words fall like a quiet verdict. You underestimated the people, and that will cost you. And as the Capitol dome lit up against the dark sky, one truth settled over Washington like thunder. One voice had risen, but could that single voice truly shake the marble walls of power? The hush in the chamber was broken by the sound of slow, steady footsteps. A nurse stepped forward, her hair silver, her face lined with years of midnight shifts. She carried no charts, no graphs, no polished statement. Just a folded piece of paper in her hand, trembling slightly under the weight of what it held. She took a deep breath, then began to read. James Carter, age 45, Maria Lopez, 58, Harold Johnson, 67, Diane Miller, 73, William Price, 52. Each name dropped like a gavel against the silence. Each age a cruel reminder that these weren't statistics. These were lives. The chamber froze. Reporters lowered their pens. A young staffer in the corner wiped her eyes before the cameras could catch it. In the gallery, a woman clutched her chest and whispered, "That was my neighbor." The moment cut through marble and politics and landed where it hurt most. People's hearts. The nurse's voice cracked, but she refused to stop. They didn't die from illness alone. They died from bills they couldn't pay. From splitting medicine in half, stretching 1 week into 2, from walking away from pharmacies empty-handed, knowing the clock was ticking on their lives. Her words pierced deeper than any statistic could. Jasmine felt her chest tighten. Her nails dug into her palms, holding back the tears threatening to spill. Every name was a weight pressing on her, but also a spark feeding her fire. These weren't strangers. They were her people, and their fight was her fight. Across the room, Gorsuch leaned back in his chair, his face hard and unmoved. But the silence surrounding him wasn't respect. It was judgment, heavy, inescapable. And as the nurse folded her paper, her hands trembling, one question roared louder than the thunder outside. How many more names must be read before justice listens? The nurse's final words still echoed when Gorsuch leaned forward. His tone was ice, each syllable slicing through the chamber. Emotions cannot override the law. The words dropped like steel. A few gasps broke the silence. To some, it sounded like authority. To others, it sounded like cruelty. Jasmine's head snapped up. Her eyes locked on his, blazing. She didn't pause, didn't breathe. She fired back. Without humanity, law is just tyranny. The chamber erupted. Reporters scribbled furiously. Viewers across America leaned closer to their screens. It wasn't just an exchange. It was a duel. Every word Gorsuch spoke came sharp and cold, like a sword drawn in perfect form. Every word Jasmine hurled back burned, alive with fury and conviction, striking like fire against ice. The tension between them wasn't just debate, it was combat. The cameras knew it. They framed her face beside his, split screen. Jasmine's eyes lit with rage. Gorsuch's expression frozen, unflinching. The image was viral within minutes. A battle of fire and frost, a clash of worlds. You cling to sentiment, Gorsuch sneered. The law's written in stone. And stone can become a weapon of oppression, Jasmine shot back. But the people are not stone. They bleed. They break. And they deserve more than cold indifference from the highest court in this nation. Gasps swept through the chamber again. The duel wasn't about one law anymore. It was about the soul of justice itself. And as the clash thundered on, a single question rose in the minds of millions watching live. Can words alone ignite a revolution? The clash had become unbearable, a storm of fire and ice. Jasmine spoke of lives and loss, and Gorsuch, with his cold precision, cut her down at every turn. Then he raised his hand once more, his voice snapping like a whip. Enough, Congresswoman. You will not turn this chamber into a spectacle. That was the spark. Jasmine's hand came crashing down on the desk, the sound exploding through the chamber like the crack of a judge's gavel. It wasn't just noise. It was a command, a shockwave that silenced every whisper in the room. Gasps broke out. Reporters froze mid-scribble. A camera zoomed in, catching her eyes blazing like fire against stone. Her chest rose, her voice thundered. This isn't Wall Street's court. This is the people's. The words rolled through the hall, heavy and unstoppable. For a moment there was silence, as though the building itself was holding its breath. Then came the eruption. Applause roared from the gallery. Activists rose to their feet, tears running down their faces as they clapped and shouted. Even hardened lawmakers, who had sat stiff and silent until now, pounded their desks in rhythm, a chorus of defiance that shook the marble walls. The cameras captured it all. the faces of Americans in the crowd, fists raised, the echo of unity drowning out the old order. It was no longer just a hearing, it was a rebellion. And across from her, Gorsuch sat rigid, his jaw clenched, the mask of authority cracking under the weight of something he couldn't control, the will of the people. For the first time, he looked less like a judge and more like a man cornered by truth. Jasmine stood unflinching in the chaos, her words still hanging like a verdict above them all. And as America watched, breathless, one question rang louder than the thunder outside. Had this moment just rewritten the history of American justice? The echoes of Jasmine's words didn't stay inside the chamber. They spilled into living rooms, diners, hospital break rooms, and factory floors across the country. America was no longer just watching, America was rising. In Florida, a grandmother sat hunched on her couch, her hands trembling as she wiped tears from her cheeks. She whispered, "She's fighting for me," and hit replay, watching Jasmine slam that desk again and again. In Detroit, a nurse went live on her phone still wearing her scrubs, her voice shaking as thousands tuned in. "This is what we've been screaming for years." Finally, someone said it where they couldn't ignore it. Her live stream exploded with comments. "We stand with Jasmine, not Wall Street's court." On the streets of Pittsburgh, workers poured out of a steel plant at the end of their shift. They raised cardboard signs scrawled with fresh ink. "Justice for the people. We stand with Jasmine." Their chants echoed down the block, captured by passing drivers who blasted the video onto social media. Across every platform, her words became the rallying cry. Clips looped under hashtags, shirts were printed overnight, and a single image went viral. Jasmine's fist on the desk, eyes blazing, the caption stamped in bold. "The People's Court." It was more than support. It was a movement, raw and immediate, surging like wildfire. For the first time in years, ordinary Americans felt like the fight wasn't theirs alone. Someone was carrying their pain straight into the halls of power. But even as the cheers spread coast to coast, a darker question lingered. Would the establishment strike back before the movement could take root? By morning, the numbers were everywhere. Polls flashed across news screens. 72% of Americans now stood with Jasmine. Not Democrats, not Republicans, Americans. Outside the Capitol, the air shook with thousands of voices. They poured in from every direction. Teachers, truck drivers, nurses, veterans. Cardboard signs rose above the sea of people. Bold words painted in red and black. "People's Court, not Wall Street's." The chants rolled like thunder. Drums pounded. Families clutched photos of loved ones lost to high drug prices, raising them high for the cameras. The crowd swelled until it looked less like a protest and more like a tidal wave aimed at the marble steps of power. Inside, the building trembled with the sound. Staffers pressed against windows, phones out, recording history in real time. Reporters rushed outside to capture the scale, their microphones barely picking up their own voices over the roar. Behind a tall pane of glass, Neil Gorsuch stood still. He watched the mass below. Tens of thousands of faces, fists raised, voices unified in defiance. For the first time, his composure cracked. His eyes narrowed, his jaw stiffened, and just for a flicker of a moment, fear cut through the stone mask. This wasn't a headline he could dismiss. This wasn't a courtroom he could control. This was the people, rising in a way even he could not silence. And as the chants grew louder, echoing through the Capitol dome, one truth was impossible to ignore. The ground beneath Washington was shifting. The roar outside the Capitol didn't fade. It bled into the chamber itself. Senators glanced at their phones, watching the live streams, reading the chants that now shook every corner of the nation. One by one, lawmakers who had sat silent for too long began to shift. It started with a single voice. A congressman from the Midwest stood, his hand flat on the desk. "I stand with Congresswoman Crockett," he declared. Then another rose, and another. Soon a wave of lawmakers stood shoulder to shoulder, their voices echoing through the chamber. For the first time, Gorsuch's power wavered. He tried to strike back, his words sharp but hollow. "This chamber is not a stage for rebellion," he snapped, but his voice no longer carried the weight it once did. His words fell flat, swallowed by the sound of applause and defiance building around him. Jasmine waited until the noise stilled. Then she rose, her presence commanding the room. She didn't shout. She didn't need to. Her voice was steady, final, like a verdict carved in stone. Justice will never wear greed's crown. The chamber erupted. Applause thundered, fists pounded desks, and the chant spread again, this time from inside the walls of power. Reporters captured the moment as history being written in real time. And across America, millions watching felt the shift. It was no longer just Jasmine versus Gorsuch. It was the people versus the system. And for the first time, the people were winning. But the question lingered, heavy as the storm outside. Could one congresswoman truly ignite a new era of American justice? The headlines hit before the chamber even emptied. Crockett versus Gorsuch, the clash that shook America. Newspapers splashed her image across front pages. Fist on the desk, eyes blazing, the caption bold, "The People's Court." Across the country, living rooms buzzed. Families gathered at dinner tables, replaying the clip again and again. A father told his teenage daughter, "That's what courage looks like." A grandmother whispered to her grandson, "She's fighting the fight I never could." In coffee shops and diners, her words became the soundtrack of the day. Workers leaned over counters, debating what it meant. Some called her the voice of a generation. Others simply called her hope. But even as the cheers spread, Jasmine knew this wasn't the end. Victory in a single hearing didn't change the price tags at pharmacies. It didn't bring back the lives lost, or guarantee that the people outside would see justice tomorrow. The system was still there, powerful, rooted, waiting to strike back. Late that night, Jasmine stood by her office window, the Capitol dome glowing in the distance. She could still hear the chants echoing faintly in her memory. For the first time in years, the people felt they had a champion. And for the first time in years, power felt the tremor of fear. But as the city settled into uneasy silence, one truth pressed heavier than the applause. This was just the first battle. The war for justice had only begun. The clash had barely faded from the headlines when Congress moved. Committees drafted the first outlines of a bill, drug pricing reform that promised to cut the cost of life-saving medicine. It was still just ink on paper, fragile and uncertain. But for the first time in decades, it felt possible. Jasmine didn't celebrate in the halls of power. Instead, she returned to the people who had carried her voice. In a quiet hospital room, she met the silver-haired nurse. The woman clasped Jasmine's hands with tears streaming down her cheeks. "You gave our pain a name," she whispered. Later, in a modest living room lined with family photos, Jasmine visited the gray-haired veteran who had raised his vial to the sky. His breathing was heavy, his hands still trembling from years of struggle. He walked slowly to a cabinet and pulled out the same bottle of insulin. He pressed it into Jasmine's palm. $800, he said, his voice rough with emotion. "This nearly killed me. Now it belongs to you. A reminder of why you can't stop." The bottle sat cold in her hand, heavier than steel, heavier than any gavel she had ever heard. It wasn't just medicine. It was a symbol of sacrifice, of betrayal, of the fight still ahead. Jasmine nodded, clutching it to her chest. Outside, the chants were quieter now, but they hadn't disappeared. They were waiting, echoing like a promise. And in that moment, with the bottle pressed to her heart, Jasmine knew a spark had been lit. But would it be enough to set the nation on fire for real change? The night air was heavy when the cameras went live. Across America, screens flickered on, living rooms, hospital waiting areas, crowded bars and quiet kitchens. Every eye turned to Jasmine Crockett, standing alone at the podium. She didn't come with papers or notes. She came with the weight of a nation. Her voice was steady, strong, but carried the ache of every story she had heard. "We are the people's voice, and we hold the gavel of justice." The words rang like church bells. In Florida, a grandmother clasped her rosary and whispered, "Amen." In Detroit, the nurse who had testified wiped her eyes. In Ohio, the veteran who had handed her his insulin vial raised his fist at the screen, whispering, "That's my congresswoman." The broadcast cut to black. White letters appeared, stark against the darkness. "If this were your family's medicine, would you stay silent?" A pause followed, long enough for the question to sink into every living room, every heart. Then the credits of reality began to roll. Not names on a screen, but the faces of millions now carrying her words into their daily lives. Hashtags reignited. Marches were planned. Conversations at dinner tables turned into vows. And as America buzzed with new energy, one truth became impossible to ignore. This was no longer just Jasmine's fight. Her story had spilled beyond Congress, beyond politics, beyond one clash in a marble hall. This was the people's fight, their voices, their justice. And as the echoes spread from coast to coast, one final line etched itself into history. This was no longer Jasmine's story. This was America's. When Jasmine stood against the cold face of power, she showed that justice only matters when built on humanity. Truth becomes power only when someone dares to give it a voice. If this moment reaches your heart, will you let it fade or turn it into a voice for change in your community? If this moment stirred something in you, don't stay silent. Like, share, and subscribe to First Shock, where the people's voice cannot be ignored. Hit the bell, because tomorrow's fight for justice could be yours. Which part of Jasmine's stand hit you the hardest? Tell us in the comments. Your voice matters, and it belongs in this story. This dramatized story is inspired by real struggles and real people. All characters and dialogue are fictionalized for commentary and education. It is not intended to defame or mislead, but to inspire reflection and civic awareness. Thanks for watching.